The flight was about to take off, and the first-class cabin carried an air of exclusivity that many could only dream of experiencing. Gleaming seats, perfectly polished surfaces, the faint aroma of luxury in the air, it was a world that seemed set apart from the rest of the plane. Among the passengers settling into their places was a man whose presence didn't need words to be felt. He wasn't draped in flashy labels or surrounded by bodyguards. Instead, his confidence radiated in a way that was quiet yet undeniable. He adjusted his cufflinks, leaned back slightly, and looked out the window, his expression calm, assured, and collected. This was a man who had fought battles far beyond the runway, who had earned his place in that seat through resilience, brilliance, and perseverance. But not everyone saw him that way. As the flight attendant made her rounds, she carried herself with the kind of sharpness that came not from professionalism but from a misguided sense of superiority. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the cabin, and when they fell on him, her brows furrowed ever so slightly. Instead of the respectful tone she carried when speaking to other passengers, her voice changed as she approached him. There was an undercurrent of arrogance, a subtle suggestion that she didn't believe he belonged where he was sitting. She questioned his presence in the VIP section with words that, though spoken lightly, carried an unmistakable edge of insult. Her posture stiffened as if guarding the space, as if protecting a seat she believed should be reserved for someone else. The contrast between the man's demeanor and hers was striking. He didn't raise his voice, didn't snap back, didn't allow her tone to disturb his calm. He sat there with a gentle, composed expression, as though he had long ago learned that the true measure of strength lies not in reacting to every slight, but in knowing when silence speaks louder than words. His quiet confidence made her arrogance appear louder, harsher, and far more unnecessary than it already was. The energy of the space seemed to shift as passengers nearby began to notice. A few subtle glances were exchanged, silent questions flickering in their eyes. Why was she addressing him differently? What had he done to deserve such treatment? The truth was, he had done nothing but exist in a space where society had not always allowed men like him to stand with pride. His very presence in that VIP seat carried the weight of history, the unspoken story of generations that had fought to break barriers and claim dignity in places where it had long been denied. He wasn't just a man in a first-class cabin, he was a symbol of what determination could achieve, of how far perseverance could carry someone when the world tried to tell them they didn't belong. And yet, here was this attendant, blind to the layers of his journey, dismissing him with arrogance that stemmed not from truth but from bias. She saw only what her assumptions allowed her to see, while failing to recognize the depth of the man before her. She mistook quiet confidence for weakness, and her arrogance fed on that illusion. But what she didn't know was that the story wasn't hers to control, that her words and attitude were about to set the stage for a revelation she would never forget. The CEO remained steady, his silence not born of submission but of wisdom. He understood the power of timing, the importance of allowing truth to reveal itself at the right moment. Around him, the tension was building. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others watched closely, sensing that something more significant was unfolding before their eyes. The cabin that had seemed so calm moments ago now carried an undercurrent of unease, as the contrast between dignity and arrogance grew sharper with every passing second. The flight attendant leaned closer, her voice tinged with a sharpness that cut through the hum of the cabin. She questioned his boarding pass as though it were forged, her tone dripping with suspicion instead of courtesy. The other passengers had been greeted with smiles, soft reassurances, and respectful nods, but when it came to him, her words carried an unmistakable sting. It wasn't the words alone, but the way she said them, the roll of her eyes, the clipped edge of her sentences, the way she glanced at him as if he were an intruder in a space reserved for others. The insult wasn't shouted, it wasn't overt, yet it pierced with a force far deeper than any raised voice could have managed. The CEO sat still, his posture unshaken, his face calm yet unreadable. He didn't need to defend himself in that instant, because he had nothing to prove. His life, his success, his very presence in that seat was the loudest evidence of all. But the cabin, once filled with polite murmurs and the rustle of magazines, had suddenly gone silent. Passengers turned their heads subtly, pretending not to watch while their curiosity betrayed them. Some shifted uncomfortably, others exchanged knowing glances, each silently registering that they were witnessing a moment where prejudice slipped into the open, raw and unfiltered. The insult was more than a careless remark, it was a reminder of how bias often disguises itself in professionalism, how disrespect hides behind a uniform and a badge of authority. Her words carried the weight of an old narrative, one that questioned the legitimacy of someone who didn't fit the image she expected to see in the VIP section. In her mind, she was enforcing order, but in reality, she was stripping away dignity. And in that moment, the air grew heavier, as though the entire first-class cabin understood the gravity of what had just been said. The CEO's silence was not weakness, it was discipline. He had been here before, in different forms, in boardrooms, in negotiations, in moments where respect was withheld not because of his worth but because of how others perceived him. He knew the power of restraint, the strength in letting arrogance expose itself before the truth could be revealed. His eyes met hers briefly, not with anger, not with fear, but with a calm steadiness that unsettled her more than any argument ever could. It was the look of a man who had already won battles she could not even imagine. Around them, the passengers were caught in a quiet storm of thoughts. Some felt a pang of discomfort, realizing the unfairness unfolding before them, while others remained frozen in silence, unsure of whether to intervene. But no one could deny the shift that had taken place. The insult, though brief, had drawn a line in the air, dividing dignity from arrogance, truth from prejudice. Every movement, every word spoken after that moment carried a different weight. The attendant, however, carried on with a confidence that was misplaced. She believed her authority gave her the right to challenge, to diminish, to humiliate. She didn't recognize that with every word she uttered, she was not only exposing her bias but also unraveling her own credibility in front of the very people she was meant to serve. What she thought was control was, in fact, the beginning of a collapse she couldn't see coming. For the CEO, the insult did not diminish him. If anything, it amplified his presence. He sat in his seat like a mountain unmoved by a storm, aware that time and truth were on his side. Every second that passed drew him closer to the moment when identity would shatter assumption, when respect would replace arrogance, and when the insult that had filled the cabin would echo back with a lesson no one on that flight would ever forget. A murmur swept through the cabin, quiet but undeniable, as the sting of the flight attendant's words lingered in the air. The insult hadn't been directed at the other passengers, yet they felt its weight as though it had brushed against them too. Some shifted in their seats, suddenly uncomfortable with the luxury that had felt so effortless just moments ago. Others kept their eyes fixed on their magazines or phones, pretending to be absorbed, but their ears were tuned sharply to the scene unfolding just a few steps away. The atmosphere had changed. The air was no longer filled with the casual hum of a first-class cabin but with a charged silence, the kind that comes when dignity is tested in front of an audience. The passengers' reactions varied, each one silently revealing more than words could. One man in a tailored suit raised his brows and shook his head, his lips tightening in disapproval, though he said nothing. A woman clutching her designer handbag glanced quickly between the CEO and the attendant, her expression caught between sympathy and hesitation, as if she wanted to speak but feared drawing unwanted attention. There were those who looked on with quiet indignation, aware of the unfairness yet unwilling to intervene, and there were others who carried the subtle expression of complicity, as though the insult had aligned with their unspoken biases. The collective silence became its own kind of judgment. No one defended the flight attendant's tone, yet no one confronted her either. In the stillness, it was clear that they recognized the wrong but chose the safety of silence over the risk of involvement. But silence, too, was loud. It revealed fear, it revealed complicity, and it revealed the deep discomfort that prejudice always brings when it exposes itself so publicly. The CEO noticed all of it. He observed the shifting gazes, the subtle frowns, the way passengers looked away when his eyes swept across the cabin. But his response remained calm, unshaken, and composed. He had been here before, In rooms where his presence was doubted, where his authority was questioned, where others' prejudices filled the space more than their respect. He knew the power of restraint, of letting others reveal themselves through their actions. His silence was not isolation, it was calculation, the quiet strength of a man who understood that patience often allows truth to speak louder than any defense could. Yet the passengers couldn't escape the discomfort that was now thick in the air. They were witnessing a scene that challenged not only the dignity of one man but the conscience of everyone who saw it. Each glance, each whisper, each stolen look became part of the story, a mirror reflecting how people respond when faced with injustice in plain sight. Some found themselves asking silently, "Should I say something? Should I intervene?" But hesitation kept their lips sealed, and the moment stretched longer than it should have, each second magnifying the weight of their inaction. The insult had not only targeted the CEO, it had put everyone else on trial. Would they allow arrogance and disrespect to pass unchecked, or would they acknowledge the injustice they had just witnessed? In that stillness, the passengers' reactions became as much a part of the story as the insult itself. Their silence gave the insult room to breathe, yet their expressions betrayed a growing awareness that something larger was unfolding, something that would not end with a careless remark and a dismissive tone. The flight attendant, however, remained oblivious to the undercurrent she had stirred. She continued with her tasks, her posture stiff with misplaced authority, her face set in the belief that she had enforced order. But the passengers knew differently. They had seen the sharpness in her tone, the arrogance in her stance, the way she singled him out when she had greeted others with respect. And though they said nothing, their silence carried its own narrative, a quiet disapproval that hung in the air, waiting for the truth to reveal itself and shift the balance of power. What the flight attendant and several passengers did not realize was that the man sitting quietly in the VIP section was not just another traveler with a ticket to first class. Beneath the calm exterior, behind the poised demeanor, was a story of success that had been written through years of resilience, sacrifice, and brilliance. He was not only a black man occupying a luxury seat, he was the CEO of a global company, a leader who had built his name and legacy in spaces that were often closed to people who looked like him. His presence in that cabin was not a mistake, not luck, not charity, it was the rightful result of ambition turned into achievement. The hidden truth about his identity carried a weight far greater than anyone on that flight could see at first glance. To the attendant, he had seemed out of place, as if wealth, power, and influence were not roles that could belong to him. But this was a man who had sat at the head of boardroom tables, who had overseen billion-dollar decisions, who had stood before world leaders and commanded respect. He had been on magazine covers, been invited to keynote conferences, and mentored rising leaders who looked up to him not only for his success but for his refusal to let barriers define him. Yet in that cabin, all of that was invisible, erased by an assumption made in seconds. The truth was like a shadow waiting to reveal itself. Passengers, unaware of who he was, began to whisper as if trying to piece together his story from his composure. Why wasn't he fighting back? Why didn't he raise his voice? The answer lay in the weight of his experiences. He knew that dignity was not always proven by confrontation, sometimes it was revealed in patience. He knew that arrogance, when unchecked, would eventually unravel itself, and when the truth finally came to light, it would silence the doubt far louder than any argument could. This hidden identity was more than just a professional title. It represented a journey paved with obstacles, moments where society told him he was aiming too high, where opportunities were withheld because of his skin, his name, his background. Yet each obstacle had been turned into fuel, each rejection into motivation, until he rose to heights that forced the world to acknowledge him. To be a CEO at his level was not just an achievement, it was a statement that barriers could be broken, that representation mattered, that excellence could never be confined by prejudice. The attendant's insult, though small in her eyes, collided with this larger truth. She was speaking not just to a passenger but to a man who carried the story of countless others who had been told they didn't belong. Her arrogance was not just directed at him but at the legacy he represented, at the narrative of progress that had allowed him to sit in that seat with quiet confidence. And when the truth of his identity would eventually surface, the shock would not only humble her but awaken everyone who had witnessed the exchange. For the passengers, the revelation would shift everything. They would realize that the man they had seen as just another traveler was, in fact, someone whose name commanded influence far beyond the walls of that plane. They would recognize that their silence, their hesitation to intervene, had played out in front of a leader whose story was larger than the moment they had just witnessed. And in that recognition, they would feel the sting of guilt, the realization that they had stood by while arrogance tried to diminish dignity. The CEO, however, did not sit in that seat to prove anything to anyone. He had long passed the stage of needing validation. His life itself was the proof. The truth about his identity was not a card he carried to silence arrogance but a reality that lived in every decision he made, every success he earned, every life he had touched along the way. Whether revealed in that moment or later, it was a truth that could not be erased, no matter how many assumptions were cast upon him. The moment the truth began to surface, the energy in the cabin shifted in an instant. What had started as a quiet insult, brushed off by the attendant as routine authority, suddenly transformed into a scene that made her own arrogance impossible to defend. Whispers traveled quickly through the rows of first class, murmurs about who the man really was, about his status, his achievements, his influence. A passenger who recognized him leaned forward, whispering to another, and soon the information rippled across the cabin like a wave breaking through silence. The name of the CEO, tied to global headlines, industry conferences, and groundbreaking accomplishments, began to replace the dismissive assumptions that had been cast upon him. The attendant's face shifted the moment she realized her mistake. The confidence that had once laced her posture drained rapidly, leaving only a tightness around her eyes and a stiffness in her movements. She tried to adjust her tone, softening her voice now, replacing arrogance with forced politeness. But it was too late. Everyone had seen the difference in how she had treated him compared to others, and the revelation of who he truly was made her behavior look not only unprofessional but humiliatingly short-sighted. Passengers who had stayed silent earlier now looked at her differently. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others cast glances of judgment that seemed to cut deeper than words. The insult that had once hung in the air as a question now had an answer, and the answer was her regret. She had doubted a man whose life and work stood as undeniable proof of belonging, a man who had accomplished more than she could have imagined, a man whose presence in that seat was more than earned. Her regret was instant, but it was also public. Unlike a private mistake, this one had unfolded before an audience, and the revelation of the CEO's identity amplified every word she had spoken earlier, making them echo louder in everyone's memory. She tried to backtrack, offering to bring him water, speaking to him with an exaggerated sweetness, but the more she tried to undo her actions, the more obvious it became that her behavior was fueled not by genuine respect but by fear of the truth that had finally cornered her. The CEO remained calm, still seated with the same quiet dignity he had held from the beginning. He didn't need to raise his voice or humiliate her in return, the truth itself had already done that. His composure, now illuminated by the reality of his identity, stood in sharp contrast to her flustered regret. He had not moved, had not spoken in anger, yet the entire power dynamic had shifted. The arrogance that once towered over him had crumbled on its own, leaving only the raw lesson that prejudice always carries consequences. For the passengers, the moment was eye-opening. They were forced to reflect not only on the flight attendant's mistake but on their own silence when it happened. Some felt shame for not speaking up, realizing they had allowed arrogance to flourish unchecked until truth revealed itself. Others looked at the CEO with newfound respect, not because of his title but because of the grace with which he had handled a situation that could have easily escalated. The regret of the flight attendant became a cautionary tale for everyone watching, a reminder of how easily assumptions can humiliate the one who makes them. The weight of her regret hung heavily in the air. Every step she took down the aisle carried it, every word she spoke to other passengers seemed strained, as though she knew all eyes were on her now, not to admire her professionalism but to measure the gap between her arrogance and her sudden attempt at humility. The truth had stripped away her authority, exposing the fragility of power built on bias. And though the CEO never uttered a single word of rebuke, the silence itself was louder than any confrontation could have been. It was a silence that allowed her regret to deepen, a silence that reminded her she had not just disrespected a passenger, but someone whose very existence in that seat was a testament to strength, progress, and resilience. The lesson that unfolded in that cabin was not written in textbooks, nor was it delivered through speeches or lectures. It revealed itself in real time, in the clash between arrogance and dignity, between assumptions and truth. The passengers who sat quietly at first now carried with them a moment that would replay in their minds long after the flight had landed. They had seen how quickly prejudice can expose itself, how easily respect can be withheld, and how instantly the balance shifts when truth comes into the light. The flight attendants' actions had left more than embarrassment, they had left a powerful reminder of why dignity should never be questioned and why respect should never be conditional. The CEO never raised his voice, never demanded recognition, and never sought revenge. His composure alone carried the weight of the lesson. By refusing to descend to the level of insult, he demonstrated that real strength is not found in confrontation but in the quiet certainty of knowing one's worth. His silence spoke to every person in that cabin louder than anger could have, teaching them that dignity does not need to be defended when it is already rooted in truth. His presence was the undeniable proof that success has no single face, no single color, no single background. The passengers reflected on what they had witnessed. Many realized that their silence in the face of injustice had been a choice, one that revealed as much about them as the flight attendant's arrogance had revealed about her. They felt the sting of complicity, the uneasy recognition that failing to stand up was not neutrality but permission for prejudice to breathe. This realization became part of the lesson, that injustice is not only about the one who acts unfairly but also about those who allow it to happen without challenge. The flight attendant, consumed by regret, carried a different lesson. She had been stripped of the false authority she once wielded and forced to face the consequences of her assumptions. Her uniform, her position, her role, all of it crumbled the moment her actions were exposed against the backdrop of truth. She had thought she was in control, but in reality, her arrogance had placed her on trial before an audience that would not forget what they had seen. Her regret was her punishment, and her humiliation became a reminder that respect must be given to all, not only to those whose identities fit neatly into her expectations. The truth that emerged that day carried more than a personal victory for the CEO. It became a collective awakening for everyone on board. It showed that stereotypes, when left unchecked, only diminish those who believe in them. It proved that judgment based on appearances will always falter when confronted with reality. It reminded each witness that respect is not a privilege reserved for a few but a basic right owed to all, regardless of title, race, or background. The lesson stretched beyond the walls of that cabin. For the CEO, it was another chapter in a story he had lived countless times, but for those passengers, it was an unforgettable encounter that challenged the way they saw the world. The image of him sitting in quiet confidence while insult tried and failed to diminish him became a symbol etched in their memories. It was a lesson they would carry into their conversations, their workplaces, their families, a reminder of how dignity outshines arrogance and how truth dismantles prejudice. And though the cabin eventually returned to its routine, the soft clinking of glasses, the low murmur of conversation, the air remained changed. Everyone knew they had witnessed something more profound than a dispute between a passenger and an attendant. They had seen the cost of arrogance, the power of truth, and the unshakable strength of dignity. They had seen how easily prejudice collapses when confronted with reality, and how quickly respect must replace judgment when the truth is revealed.